Welcome back to We Nurture. I'm your host, Chanilu Kuntz. Before we begin with today's episode, I'm so excited to let you know that we have just launched our We Nurture website. You can discover more at wenurture.us. To join our mailing list and to connect with us with your questions or comments, please email us at wenurture@kimberton.org. We're excited to deepen our connection with you as we continue our journey together. In today's episode of We Nurture's Connecting Communities, I've invited my eldest daughter, Genevieve, to talk about her experiences with Waldorf education as a person of color. Our conversation delves deep as Genevieve speaks openly and I must say courageously. You might find our conversation to be uncomfortable, but these are the conversations that must take place in our home, in our schools, with our family members and friends, and in our society as a whole. Transformation must take place so that we can all truly be safe, be seen, honored, and experience equality in every area of life. I invite you to join me as our conversation begins. Welcome, Genevieve. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So my first question for you, Genevieve, is in your earlier years in Waldorf education, did you feel accepted by your teachers and your peers?
In my earlier years, I actually attended two different Waldorf schools, the Waldorf school in Orange County in California, and then also a Waldorf school in Vancouver, Canada. And those are more diverse areas. So the schools were also a little bit more diverse. So I really didn't pay too much attention to the different races of my classmates because I had a more diverse group of students surrounding me. And I would say that I did feel accepted and I had lots of friends, but there were sometimes little instances that made me a bit uncomfortable. The diversity in my schools at that time didn't really include Black students. So it was usually around things like teachers or students touching my hair and making comments about how it felt like sheep's wool or pointing out little differences like that, which I didn't really appreciate, but I wasn't really upset about them. They just made me a little bit uncomfortable. And then I would say that the teachers didn't really acknowledge that the students were of different races, which in some ways can be positive because I don't think we need to go around constantly pointing out people's differences. But at the same time, I think it's more beneficial to celebrate the differences than to just ignore them. But overall, I would say that I did feel accepted by my teachers and by my peers. Even though I was aware that I was a different race from most of my classmates, I was definitely confident in myself. I never even considered that someone would view or treat me differently just because of my race.
Mm-hmm. And as a person of color, when did you begin to notice that peers called you out as different in a way that you were more consciously aware of?
I would say that really started to happen when we first moved here to Pennsylvania, because the area we're living in here, Chester County, was probably the least diverse area I had lived so far, potentially the least diverse area that I've lived in my life. So it was a bit of a rude awakening for me. So I can give some examples. I remember, must have been around 5th grade, I was on my school bus going home, and the student who said these rude comments to me was not a Kimberton student because it was a shared school bus. He started shouting things about how your skin color was the color of poop or of dirt. And he was clearly trying to get me upset. And I was just a little bit confused by his comments. I don't think I'd ever had someone say something so blatantly racist to me. But I started pointing out to him, there's lots of good things that are brown, like chocolate, for example. And that ended the interaction. So that was one of the earlier times that I started to realize that people really might view me differently. But some of the things that were happening at Kimberton, I was suddenly the only brown person in my class, and there was only one other mixed race student in my class. we added up to all the diversity in our grade. He was a Asian and white student. I would often have other students ask me to explain stereotypically African American slang term as if I somehow just had secret knowledge into everything that Black Americans know. I would sometimes have teachers turning to me to give details on the history of slavery or African history, even though I was a child and they were the teacher in that scenario. There were times where people assumed out loud in conversations with me that maybe all of my Black relatives currently lived in or had grown up in a ghetto, which I felt was very rude and ignorant. Comments about how I look so Black in this outfit, or pointing out that maybe they're more Black than me because they like this rapper and I said I don't really appreciate his music. So I would usually respond to comments like that by asking them, why are you so obsessed with being Black? I was confused what the big deal was. And then one thing that was really frustrating to me, as I got older, maybe around the 8th or 9th grade, some of my peers would use the N-word with the A ending, not with the ER ending, to refer to their friends, maybe as they thought a rapper would do to talk to his friends. And since all the students doing that were white students, I felt very uncomfortable with it. And I would ask them to stop, but they never really stopped doing it up until when I graduated. I continued asking them to please not use that word, but I didn't feel like anything I said was going to really sink in or get them to stop.
Do you think that teachers were aware of this? It sounds like they didn't really understand your discomfort with that, or even just the inappropriateness of using that word at all.
I'm sure the teachers heard it being used because it was really used every day, probably. It was very often that I heard that. But I never heard the teachers reprimand any of the students for saying that word or calling them out and asking them to stop or pointing out how inappropriate it was. But yeah, I really did feel like those different experiences that I had, they weren't malicious. The people saying those things or asking those questions, they weren't being malicious. I felt it was really just coming from an uneducated or maybe inconsiderate place, because my peers who were white, they really didn't face diversity in their day-to-day lives. So I feel like that ignorance ended up coming down on my head and on the heads of the other students of color in the school.
That was a lot to deal with. So it must have affected you in ways, like you mentioned, you were confused or just felt annoyed, angered.
Yeah, I was definitely frustrated by those experiences because I felt like I was just a normal girl just trying to live my life, go to school. People around me seemed to feel the need to rudely interrupt me going about my daily life just to remind me that I was different from them.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt I didn't feel that different, but I knew that my peers did feel that divide.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, this was definitely true at school, but also outside of school. I don't think it's just a Kimberton problem. I think it's kind of like a society problem.
Mm-hmm.
The little reminders that people would point out that you're different, they weren't always blatant. They could be more subtle too, like maybe, everyone turning around to look at you when slavery is mentioned in class, or could be people asking you where you're from. And then when you tell them, oh, I'm from Pennsylvania, they'll respond and say, oh, but no, where are you really from? So at the end of the day, I was not ashamed to be different. And I never wished that I was white, but I did wish that my peers could view me as a person and stop fixating so much on my race.
What is so unfortunate is that I did not know what Genevieve was experiencing until this year after the death of George Floyd. A rush of stories have since come out. When I asked Genevieve why she did not tell me or her father what she was going through, she expressed that perhaps she didn't speak up because she felt that her teachers were aware of what was happening and the words that were being said, but that because they did nothing, about this. She felt in her own mind what would change if she told me. She also felt that there was a lack of support from her teachers and that she was on her own. It makes me sad to know this now. Let's switch here a little bit and talk about your high school years at Kimberton Waldorf School from a social perspective. Could you describe how you felt in that situation?
I was friends with pretty much everyone in my high school. It's a very small high school. At the time I attended, probably averaged around 80 or 90 students for all 4 grades. So I knew lots of people very well, and I was friends with a lot of people. And Waldorf schools are generally very open communities, and I really don't think that any of my peers disliked me because of my race. There were small things going on that irritated me or made me uncomfortable. Some of the things that I was mentioning before. It's kind of awful to say, but it's not so hard to get used to small microaggressions. So I mostly just brushed off negative experiences and I didn't reflect on them too much till I was older. And I also feel like the Waldorf School being such a small community and the students having close-knit relationships that are almost familial relationships, that made it easier for me to forgive my peers when they would sometimes cross a line. Maybe I was even too quick to forgive because I did feel very close to them and they were my friends. So I would find a way to just, kind of accept what was going on. But that's not to say that I never spoke up or gave pushback when I felt like one of my friends had said or done something inappropriate. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that also has to do with the close relationships. If they hadn't been my close friends, then I wouldn't have felt comfortable to say, I don't agree with what you just said, or I think that was inappropriate. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it was still hard for me because, as I was mentioning before, the teachers weren't really there to support me in reprimanding students. So it was frustrating being a token biracial Black student and then also the only person objecting to things, because it makes it easy for someone to just dismiss my objections as just me being overly sensitive as that one person of color in the room. So that side of it was frustrating because I felt like I was left there to teach my peers about race instead of the adults being there to teach them about it. But despite those negatives, I really did value my friendships that I developed in high school and in middle school as well. And I would say many of the people that I graduated with are still good friends of mine today. I try to stay in touch with people. I get to visit some of them sometimes. And even with the time and distance between us, we still have a strong, almost family relationship and connection that we developed in our time at Kimberton. And I actually live in the same neighborhood with 2 other Kimberton alumni, and we spend quite a bit of time together. And I feel like our relationship now as adults really is rooted in our time together at Kimberton, because we're all very different people from each other, but we had a chance as kids to get to know and understand each other. So that contributes to how we respect and care for each other as adults. Mm-hmm. And, being able to have some of those hard conversations as high school students, even though it was happening without the support of our teachers, I think that leads into the type of conversations that we're able to have today, because we are able to have very honest conversations and we don't feel that we need to agree on every single thing that's said. Mm-hmm. I think that comes out of the atmosphere that a Waldorf school tries to create between their students.
So now, since several years have passed since you graduated and you went on to university and have had time to just reflect on your experiences at Kimberton and meeting up with friends that you graduated with, you feel that at this time you can have even more open conversations maybe about what happened in high school or the current climate of this country now?
Yeah, I definitely do feel that way, because I feel that we were encouraged to consider other people's points of view and to respect and love each other, even though we are all very different people from each other. So those are some of the people who I feel I can have the most open, honest conversations with about my views on what's going on today. Because honestly, talking about race can be very uncomfortable. I think, especially among white people, I think it's very hard to talk about race without feeling uncomfortable, maybe guilty, or it's just a very hard topic to address. And those friends that I am still in contact with from Kimberton today are some of the people that I feel like I can really honestly express my opinions to them.
Mm-hmm. And then from a curriculum perspective at Kimberton Waldorf School, could you highlight for us how that experience was?
Yeah, I really enjoyed my classes. I always had a good time at school, but in college and since then, reflecting on the curriculum at Kimberton, I've come to realize that it was very Eurocentric in terms of history and literature, especially. We really focused on Europe, European history, books by white and European authors. And, we did sometimes get to spend time on other countries. Like I remember we learned a lot about Chinese history in high school, which was very interesting and it was very informative, but we never took the chance to compare the lessons learned from China and look at our own country as well. And, we really spent minimal time talking about the history of Africa, South America, the Middle East. And we did not really talk too much about race in America, which I think was pretty problematic. It kind of felt like the overall story was just our country was struggling with racism, and then Martin Luther King came, ended that, and since then we've been good, and America is an equal country and racism is not a problem anymore. And I think we all know that that's not a realistic version of what actually happened. But I would say one area that was done very well was when we studied the Holocaust, because we talked really honestly about the details of what happened, and we had discussions and debates about responsibility and accountability, and we really went in depth with that topic. I wish that same sort of focus and in-depth conversation had been applied to our own country's negative history. For example, the genocide of Native Americans, things like that we never discussed, which I think are very relevant parts of our history. We didn't really get too much into slavery or the Civil War. And these are really horrific parts of history. So I understand that they're difficult to talk about, especially when it's your own country's history. I think that a lot of my negative experiences surrounding race were rooted in ignorance, and learning this type of history could have helped my peers to know better than to say those negative things to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that more diversity in the school would have made it possible to have deeper conversations?
I don't think that would detract from anything, but I don't think that adding diverse students is a one and done solution, because if you bring in more diverse students, the teachers are still going to be teaching them the same Eurocentric history. So I think that the change really needs to come out of the curriculum and from the teachers and the leadership to create a space where diverse students would really want to be and would really feel like those conversations could be initiated. So I'm certainly not against more diverse students, but I don't think that that's the first step to take towards bringing more diversity into the school. I think first you have to prepare the space to really be welcoming to those students.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so in reflecting back on your education at Kimberton, especially seeing how much that you gained in knowledge in your college education, what is it that is needed then? What is really needed then at Kimberton Waldorf School on the high school level, or even in the middle school, starting in the middle school level, in terms of really dealing honestly with the history in this country?
I think that just confronting it head on and really acknowledging what happened in our country, also finding positive things to share as well. even to this day, I don't know very much African history, but you can see there's ruins of old castles and mosques and huge structures there that to me suggest that there was very advanced societies there. So stories about those societies, I would imagine, could be positive stories, like share some inventions or innovation that came out of that area. I think things like that can be really empowering for the younger students. And then also confronting our country's history really head on for the older students, I think is very empowering, because it's really about knowing your own history. Then when somebody says something ignorant to you, you can be prepared to defend yourself. Not knowing the full history of slavery in our country, for example, I feel like I didn't have the best arguments to make when I was asking my peers to stop using the N-word. All I could really say to them is, that's insulting, that's disrespectful, that's upsetting to some people. But I couldn't really speak to the details of why that word is such a toxic word. So it left me on my own to build confidence in my identity, because people like me were not being acknowledged very often, and they were not being celebrated by the curriculum.
And then if that part of the curriculum had really addressed the history of the country, especially in high school, in depth, it would have also brought knowledge and awareness to your peers too, to awaken them to what they were saying and what they were doing, and the kind of position that they were putting you in.
Yeah, I think that by educating the white students, you are protecting the students of color from some negative experiences. And also, I think that you're empowering the white students as well to break out of the cycle of shame and guilt that seems to just be in all of our conversations about race. If they feel like, I know this history and I can talk about it honestly, then they can break out of that cycle and really have honest conversations about race.
Instead of going to a place, like you said, of feeling ashamed or feeling guilty and kind of staying there, but to break out of that and move forward from there.
And also, I think that a lot of people are curious to learn more about race in our country. And it's almost dangerous not to talk about it in school, because we have all these resources available to us to get on the internet and research this on our own. But as we all know, the internet is full of misinformation, and a lot of it is bigoted or racist views that are being shared on there. So I think we really need to be careful that we're teaching kids what really happened in school, so they don't turn to unreliable sources and come out of it with some negative conclusions.
On big misconceptions. And yes. And so my last question for you is, considering all that you have shared about your experience as a Waldorf student, would you recommend Waldorf education?
Yeah, I think I would still recommend Waldorf education, but I would say that with the caveat that each Waldorf school is incredibly influenced by the teachers who work there. I think that a Waldorf school has all the potential to bring diversity into their curriculum, because they're not really as restricted as public schools are. They don't take part in standardized testing, and they have a lot more control over their curriculums. The really positive things that seem to be consistent across the different Waldorf schools that I attended or that I visited or talked to other students about, it's the sense of community and acceptance and really wanting to be an open and loving community, even if there are sometimes internal struggles with that. Waldorf schools are often small communities, so people have a chance to develop deep friendships with people that in the outside world they may not have become friends with at all. That can build a really strong sense of empathy for people who are different from yourself. I do love how Waldorf schools celebrate art and creativity. With all of that in mind, I think that Waldorf schools can really be leaders in bringing diversity into their curriculums. They have the scaffolding there, but they just need to keep building out on the core of the Waldorf values to fit our society today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Genevieve. You've really enlightened this topic for me in terms of what you shared from your perspective as a Waldorf graduate, and also your perspective looking at the curriculum that you experienced at Kimberton Waldorf School, as well as juxtaposing that to our society, the society that we live in, the country that we live in, and its history, and how we really need to dig deep and be honest and truthful and unpack all the things that need to be unpacked so that we can move forward with a more just society.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm certainly not an expert on these topics, but I'm happy to have the opportunity to share my perspective. I hope that people can take something from our conversation.
I would like to give you an update since my conversation with Genevieve. She, along with other alumni from her class, met with the governance team at Kimberton Waldorf School, and they had a very constructive conversation, which has led the school to implement immediate change in the curriculum as well as in other areas of the school. I encourage school leaders, Waldorf and otherwise, to reach out to their alumni of color as well as current students of color and hear their experiences. This is a very critical step as we all move forward to achieve social justice for all. Extend your heart and your hand. Provide a safe listening space, and then be prepared to listen deeply. And then, as an institution, take immediate action so that lasting transformation will happen.